Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf tzadi vav. We're going to get started with the issue of tfiyut ayin that we left with in the previous sugya. So we were talking about tfiyut ayin. We were talking about a piece of meat that was nitalem in ayin that somebody didn't notice, right? They weren't watching it the whole time. And then they come back and then they see a piece of meat and they say, oh, that's the same piece of meat, right? They didn't have a siman. They couldn't give any sort of clear signs, but they did have tfiyut ayin. And then we said, Rabbi said, I would have thought tfiyut ayin isn't as strong because when it comes to returning lost items, we don't really consider tfiyut ayin as a consideration. I can't say, oh, that's my ring. I know, I can see. It looks just like my ring. But no, we may ask for simanim. So I would have thought tfiyut ayin is less than that. But now that I saw, beginning of our daf, amina tfiyut ena adif. I say that now I realize that tfiyut ayin must be better. Now, the commentaries say it's not really better. It's equal, because they said, do you have a siman? You'd never siman. Okay, we do with tfiyut ayin. Okay, that's first of all. Second of all, Tosfot points out a bit of an issue. In other words, we're comparing it to Elu Mitziot and finding lost items, but it's really kind of different. And Tosfot says, first of all, what do you mean, lo mahadrina b'tfiyut eina? We actually do. What case do we? If a Talmid Chacham, comes and says, oh, I know that's mine, we allow them. Why? What's the whole consideration when it comes to lost items? Consideration is somebody lying, right? If I come and say, oh, I know that's my ring, maybe I'm just trying to get a ring for free, right? So we're worried about that. Now, when you have a person who's trusted, and they claim the Talmidei Chachamim were trusted, they were honest, so they trusted them to say, oh, that's mine. Okay, so he says, what do you mean there is no tfiyut ayin? Okay, so then Tosfot has an interesting answer. Okay, you can think of different answers to that, but Tosfot's answer is that there's actually different levels of tfiyut ayin. There's tfiyut ayin where you kind of say, oh, like I sort of think that that's mine. There's a stronger tfiyut ayin. Like this isn't a black and white type of thing. There's a scale. Right? There's simanim, which are very clear, right? Which at this point we're putting on the far end of the scale as the most clear. Then we have tfiyut ayin, where we're now going to say in our case, that's good enough. And that's even equal to, even though it's not as much of an identifying thing as simanim. And then there's tfiyut ayin, which is even less than that, okay? So what he's saying is tfiyut ayin of here is, they're going to say even here, maybe it's even a lower level. And the tfiyut ayin of the rabbis has to be a higher level of tfiyut ayin in Elu Mitziot. Whereas here, we're going to even allow a very low level that doesn't exist at all right, where you just kind of say, oh yeah, that kind of looks like there was the meat that I had before, that even that lower level is going to be equal to the level of simanim. Okay? What's interesting about Tosfot is not so much how he answers the question, at least for me, it's this concept of there being a scale. And there's different levels, and for different things, and that's what we're going to get into soon, you might need a different kind of tfiyut ayin in different scenarios, okay? And I want you to start thinking about it already, that it's a little bit different when you're worried someone's lying than when you're not really worried someone's lying. You're just trying to figure out, did this piece of meat get taken away by something else? And then you could see why a lower level of tfiyut ayin would be sufficient. Now the Gemara brings up some other cases and says, if you don't say that tfiyut ayin works like simanim, there is an interesting question. How does a blind person have relations with his wife? Because the blind person can't see his wife. How does he know when he gets home that there's not some other woman in his bed? Okay, a little bit strange, but they raise this issue that obviously, now we're going to try to figure it out, because a blind person can't see either. So it's definitely not tfiyut ayin, but now we're going to expand tfiyut ayin to include other things. Ubnei Adam, another question. Any person, if mutarim b'nafshotehem balayla, at night, no one can see in those days. Now, nowadays we have lights, but in those days people can see. How are any of them allowed to be with their wives at night? Ela b'tfiyut eina dekala. What do we say? He can hear her voice and recognize her voice. Okay, this reminds us of the whole Yaakov story with Rachel and Leah. Okay, but where he didn't realize, and he only saw in the morning. But theoretically, you can recognize by voice. Okay, we could say all sorts of other things. Smell, right? All our senses. Touch. Okay, there's all sorts of ways to identify people that are not just with the eye. Notice, by the way, they call it tfiyut eina dekala. The tfiyut ayin, which is by eyes, by sight of voice, right? It just became a term tfiyut ayin, which means some other alternative method. Obviously, it's not using eyes. Here we're using something else. We're using the voice. So hachanami b'tfiyut eina. So now we're going to say, just like tfiyut eina works with voice, it can also work with sight. Amar Yitzchak Berei Rav Masharshi, he's going to further prove this Teda. And here he's actually going to say in a case where Tfiyut Ayin works better than Simanim. So while it was kind of obvious to us before that Simanim are always better, but now we're going to see that there's a certain case where Tfiyut Ayin is better. And this is going to allow us to start to think about the differentiations of what Tfiyut Ayin means in different cases. De'ilu atu betray, if two witnesses came for Amre Planya, dehai simane, v'hai simana katal nafsha. If they say, we saw a man, he was wearing a black shirt with a red baseball hat and blue pants, and here's the man, look, he's got, or he had a scar on his face, and here's a man with a scar on his face, okay? So are we going to allow, now they didn't recognize the person, they didn't know him at all, but they said, oh, I know, he was, he had that scar, and he, some outside siman, we're definitely not going to kill him, lo katlina, you're not going to issue the death penalty based on some simanim about, oh, the person had this on his leg, and that on his there, and this, whatever it might be. V'ilu amre, but if they say, oh, I recognize that person, now they can't tell us anything, like what, does he have a hair with curls or not? Like, people don't remember, do people have curly hair, do people have, brown eyes or green eyes, or, sometimes you remember those things, sometimes you don't. So if they gave simanim and said the person had a scar on their face, or they didn't know if the person had a scar on their face, but they did know that the person, that was the person they know. Like, let's say you see someone murdering and you know that person. So when you see them, you immediately identify them because you know that's them. So we can use Tfiyut Ayin. Now, this isn't a case, and Rashi points out that you recognize them. You knew the person. It would have to be you knew the person. Now, even that is tricky because sometimes you know the person, but maybe it wasn't them you think, right? Sometimes you see people and you think it's the person that you know. Turns out it's not. But, right, I think there's something natural about us that we see someone and we associate them with someone we know. But let's just assume that you really think you recognize this person. You just say, oh, I know, right? Like, think about when they do a lineup and they say to the person, right, is this the person? Is this the person? That's Tfiyut Ayin, right? They don't ask them questions, what did they look like? And, they might and try to sketch up a person, but it's very hard to sketch up a person in words. So Tfiyut Ayin, when it comes to people and when it comes to identifying people, is different and better than simanim, because simanim are technical things which could appear in another person. Okay, so it's very tricky here, and that's why it's an interesting thing that depending on the scenario, whether again with Aveda we're worried about someone lying. Okay, in our case we're just trying to figure out was the meat taken away or not, so Tfiyut Ayin is sufficient. In the case right now, simanim would also help. In the case of the murderer and identifying a murderer, completely different criteria. So very, very interesting topic. But anyway, what they're trying to say in this whole sugya, they're obviously differentiating, and that I think is what's underlying. The simple reading is just saying, look, Tfiyut Ayin could be even better than simanim, and look how it works. Amar Rav Ashi, one more thing, Teda di'ilu amar le'inish l'shluche, if you say to your messenger, and here's another proof of the Tfiyut Ayin working better by people, Karye leplanye, dehai simana v'hai simana, go find so-and-so with this siman and that siman. But the shaliach doesn't know them, right? I was thinking it's like going on a blind date, and you go to meet someone, and you don't know what they look like. Even if you look at their WhatsApp picture, sometimes, they don't exactly look like they did in the picture. And you might not identify them so easily. Like you'll say, okay, brown eyes, curly hair, whatever it might be, right? You try to think of external simanim, but safek yadale, safek lo yadale. It might be the person will find them, it might be they won't. But if they've seen the person, they recognize them, then the next time they see them, they'll recognize them again. Okay, so that's where Tfiyut Ayin can actually be better than simanim, and notice it's in humans, okay, which I think is a bit, maybe perhaps a different situation also. So there's a lot of interesting distinctions to be made here. Okay, moving to the next Mishnah. Now we're back to Gid and Nasheh. We're going to see a machlokah between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, and then we're going to find out there's a whole slew of machlokah between them. Hanotel Gid and Nasheh. Okay, first of all, one was right leg, right? Is the Gid and Nasheh only on the right, or also on the right and the left? So the Mishnah says, Hanotel Gid and Nasheh, tzarich she'itol et kulo. If you take out the Gid and Nasheh, when you take it out, you remove it, you have to take out the whole thing. This is Tanakama, we saw it in the name of Rabbi Meir a few dapim ago. You have to take everything out. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda said, Ada Shofi. You just have to cut. This is a discussion we had about the chelev of the Gid and Nasheh. Is the chelev forbidden or not? Rabbi Yehuda says, Kedei lakayem bo mitzvat netila. Rabbi Yehuda says you just have to get what needs to come out. Okay, he doesn't actually specify what that is, but you don't have to go all the way down. Ha'ochel migid and Nasheh kezayit sofeg arba'im. If you eat a kezayit, you get lashes. Achalo ve'ein bo kazayit, but even if it doesn't have a kazayit, if you ate the entire gid, we're going to see later, this is because it's a birya, it's its own complete entity. This is like the same thing with insects. You can't eat a whole insect even though it's less than a kazayit. That's why we have a whole issue with washing vegetables. Okay, you're chayav. Okay, you're going to get lashes. Achal mizeh kazayit u'mizeh kazayit. If you ate both gid and ashes, sofek shmonim, you're going to get 80 lashes. This is because the right and the left are forbidden according to the rabbis. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, eno sofeg ela arba'im. Rabbi Yehuda says only 40. Okay. Gemara starts off with Bar Piyule. Okay, this is a person. Bar Piyule, Havakai Kamei de Shmuel. He was in front of Shmuel. V'kamenaker atma, and he was taking out from a thigh the gid and asher. Havakagaim le, and he was cutting it, meaning he wasn't going all the way down and taking out more. Right, the stuff that was within the flesh. Okay, that's the bottom part that Rabbi Meir would make them take out, where there was more fat in there from the gid and asher, and you have to take it all out. Amalei chut beitvei. He says, go take more out. Hashta, he said, now, right, there's a, 1 second, right, it should have the word ilo chazitach, if I hadn't seen you, spitali surah. If I hadn't watched what you were doing, you would have given me something forbidden. What's going on here? Wow, Bar Piyule got a little nervous. Irtad, he got scared. And Shmuel was saying, I almost fed you Isser, and this is probably the way he always took out the gid. So he got a little nervous. Nafal sakin miyadeh, his knife falls from his hand. And Shmuel realizes he got the guy worked up. So Amar Le, he says to him, okay, don't worry. Lo tirtad, don't be nervous. Do orelach ki Rabbi Yehuda orelach. The way you must have learned was Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, you're doing Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. It's not like it's completely wrong. You're holding by a different position than I hold by, and then the mainstream is. Amar Rav Sheshet, Mar de Shaka Bar Piyule. Now Rav Sheshet makes a statement, and we're going to infer something and say, wait, something doesn't make sense about this. Rav Sheshet said, Mar de Shaka Bar Piyule, what Bar Piyule took out, de oraita le Rabbi Yehuda. What was required by Torah law according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now something sounds strange about this, because it makes it sound like Rabbi Yehuda requires more by rabbinic law. And if that's the case, we're going to see, then how did Bar Piyule, who taught him that he could do that and not take it all out if by rabbinic law you have to do it? Right? Just because you have to do it by Torah law doesn't mean you don't have to do it by rabbinic law. So they say the following, Michla, from what Rav Sheshet just said, Deshir de Rabbanan le Rabbi Yehuda, that he left in something that was forbidden by rabbinic law according to Rabbi Yehuda. Ela de orele kaman orele. So then who taught him he could do that and not take out what the rabbis required according to Rabbi Yehuda's position? So Ela Amar Rav Sheshet, we change what Rav Sheshet said. My deshakil Bar Piyule deoraita. Okay, what deoraita? It's missing words here. The Bach adds deoraita de Rabbi Meir. What he took out, what Rav Sheshet was trying to say, is what Bar Piyule took out was what was required by Torah law according to Rabbi Meir. Umay deshir de Rabbanan de Rabbi Meir, and what he left over was the Rabbanan requirement of Rabbi Meir. De Rabbi Yehuda filami de Rabbanan chari, because according to Rabbi Yehuda that was enough. Okay, you just have to cut it. You don't have to go all the way down to where it's intertwined with the flesh. Okay, with the meat. So that explains it. Now we're going to go on. But we're going to connect with the machloka Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. And like I said, we're going to see a bunch of machlokot. So far we saw 3. Okay, you have to take out the whole gid according to Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Yehuda, just, right, not where it's intertwined with the flesh lower down. You are chayav according to the rabbis or Rabbi Meir, even if it was less than a kazayit. Rabbi Yehuda thinks you need a kazayit, and the right and the left. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda says only right, and the rabbis say right and left. So now we're going to have a statement of Shmuel. Amar Shmuel, lo asra Torah ela al hakaf bilvad. The Torah only forbade what is on the kaf. We talked about this, where the kaf is the rounded spoon area, which is near the top of the bone of the gid. Okay, but it's even a little bit lower than the top of the gid, and it's this area. If you have the Koren, the Steinsaltz, they have a good picture. Okay, where there's basically the top part where the gid comes out is not part of it. Then you have the rounded part, that's part of it, and then when it goes down, further down into the flesh, that's the part that only is required by rabbinic law. Okay, we're going to see. So Shmuel says, we're going to see soon that Shmuel actually matches the rabbi's position, which is a little bit strange. We're going to talk about it soon. Shmuel says, Lo asra Torah ela she'ala kaf bilvad. So the Torah is only that small part that's on the rounded part inside. Again, right near the bone, this rounded sinew that goes around where there's rounded flesh. Shenemal, how do we know? Because it says, al kaf hayarech. Kaf is a spoon, it's this rounded part. Amar Rav Papa Kitanai. Rav Papa says this is actually machloket Tanaim. And we're going to see it's between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, but it's going to take us a bit to get there. Achalo embo kazayit chayav. Rabbi Yehuda omer ad sheyebo kazayit. So we start with our Mishnah. The machloket about if you eat a whole thing, you're chayav. According to the whole gid. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you're not. You have to eat a kazayit. My time of the Rabbanan. Briyahi. Like we said before, it's a bria, it's a complete entity. Moving now to Amud Bet. The Rabbi Yehuda achila k'tiva be. Rabbi Yehuda says, what do you mean? It says, al ken lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael. B'nei Yisrael won't eat. Eating always means a requisite amount of kazayit. Okay, so top of Amud Bet now, comes Rabbi Yehuda, he says, no, it doesn't have to be, it has to be a kazayit. You're not going to be obligated if you eat an entire gid and it wasn't a kazayit. B'Rabbanan, so basically we're going to start a ping pong now, because Rabbi Yehuda says, it says lo yochlu. Lo yochlu means you have to eat a kazayit. So now comes the rabbis, we have to explain, what do they do with achila, lo yochlu? They said it doesn't have to be a kazayit. So what is that? Achila usually goes with kazayit. So what do they do with that word? Rabbanan, hayi achila di eat be arba'a v'chamisha zeitim v'achal chad kazayit mechayev. If it had 4 or 5 zeitim, and they ate 1 kazayit of it, meaning you didn't eat the whole gid, you're going to be chayav, because yochlu means kazayit. Oh, there is a case where you're chayav kazayit. There's a case where you're not chayav kazayit, and there's another case where you could eat not the whole thing. You could either eat the whole thing and it's not a kazayit and be obligated, or you could eat part of it, you're obligated because you ate a kazayit. Rabbi Yehuda. Well, now we're assuming Rabbi Yehuda would agree with this. So where does he learn this from? Right? Because it's true, he said kazayit, but maybe that means when you eat the whole thing and it's a kazayit. So how do you know if you eat only part of it? Me'asher al kaf, and as again, this means you'll get lashes. Me'asher al kaf hayarech nafka. Because it says, which is on the kaf hayarech. Now, Rabbi Yehuda thinks, we're going to see here in a minute, that Rabbi Yehuda thinks the part that's on the kaf hayarech, which Shmuel said that's the only part that's obligated by Torah, Rabbi Yehuda actually thinks that it's more than that is obligated. Now remember, it's a little tricky because Rabbi Yehuda said the part that goes into the flesh is not a problem. But apparently he thinks that there's a bigger part of it, okay, that's not part of the flesh, didn't go into the flesh, and it's also not part of the kaf hayarech, and that part is what he's talking about here that's going to be included as well. So he basically says, Asher kaf hayarech means that you're going to get from there that whatever, right, if the meat, Asher kaf hayarech, but there's even more that's forbidden, and if you eat that, you're obviously going to be obligated, because that's what the pasuk says. So then we're saying, oh, even if you eat part of it and not the whole thing. Okay? Now, Rabbanan, hahum ibayala l'chid Shmuel. The rabbis need that for Shmuel. Why does it say al kaf hayarech? Not because it's saying, if you eat part, you'll be obligated, because the kaf hayarech is the whole thing, and that's Shmuel. Tamar Shmuel, lo ascha Torah, elash al kaf hayarech. The Torah only forbade the part that's on the kaf hayarech, and that's the rabbi's position, which now we see holds like Shmuel. And Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say that, because he actually thinks Al-Kasher Kaf Hayarech is showing that even if you only eat part, you're going to be obligated, because there's even more that's forbidden. But Rabbi Yehuda, so now what does he say with Kaf Hayarech? Ha-Yarech Tiv, Kula Yarech. Okay, he says the Yarech teaches you that the whole Yarech is a problem. Okay, so actually I should just clarify one thing. Right, so Asher Al Kaf Hayarech, he says, teaches you that even part of it, right? Just one second. Asher al kaf hayarech delo be'in, right? You don't. Asher al kaf hayarech means you don't need to eat the whole thing. But what is the whole thing? Hayarech teaches you the whole part as it goes along the yarech. Again, you have to say, but not the part where it goes into the flesh. So it's a little bit tricky. But the part that's near the yarech is a problem, even in addition to the kaf hayarech, and that's what he does with the word yarech. And with there, it's very clear he doesn't hold like Shmuel. Rabbanan, what do they do with hayarech? They're dealing with the definitive, right? The hay, the yarech, the thigh. Hahu de pashit isura b'kula yarech lafuchei chitzon de lo u'la'olam shalakaf. Okay, let's start with the end. It really is only what's on the kaf. But so why does it say on the thigh? Because what they want you to know is that it's which gid is it? There's 2 gid anashes, right? There's the gid achitzon and the gid apnimi that we've talked about before. Now the gid achitzon is by the yarech. Okay, we want you to know it's that one. The gid apnimi, that's the one you're obligated for. That's the one that's near the that goes by the whole yarech. whereas the gira chitzon either comes out of the yarech but doesn't really go along the whole yarech, or it's in a different area that's not even near the yarech. Remember, there's a machloket about what the gira chitzon is, but it's to tell you the one that's forbidden by Torah law is the one that's specifically by the thigh, but not the whole thigh, only by the spoon of the thigh. V'hai kaf. So now they just have a question on both of them, which is if we're darshaning, each one is darshaning this asher al kaf yarech. Okay, remember, let's just remind you. Rabbi Yehuda said that's you could be obligated for part and not the whole. If you eat a kazayit of, let's say, 4 or 5 zaytim, the gib is 4 or 5 zaytim, you only eat a kazayit. The rabbi said only what's on the kaf yarech. That was also like Shmuel. But they both darshaned it. But kaf mebayile lemiute of delay kaf. Isn't it coming to exclude the bird? Doesn't have a kaf yarech. Remember, the gid anashe of the bird is excluded from that word. So they say, oh, that's not a problem. Trei kaf k'tive. The word kaf appears in the pasuk twice. Let's read the pasuk. Alken yochlu b'nei Yisrael gid anashe. Therefore, alken lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael gid anashe. You can't eat it. Asher al kaf yarech. That's what we've been darshaning. Ada yom hazeh, to this day, ki naga bekaf yarech Yaakov b'gid anashe. Because he touched the kaf yarech, so because kaf appears twice, we could darshan it for 2 different things. Okay, so that was the back and forth from the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda. So we have 4 machlokot between them. One is right and left, okay, or just right. According to according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's just right. We have, do you have to take out the whole thing? According to the rabbis, yes, which we said is Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Yehuda, no. You don't have to go all the way down into the basar. However, Rabbi Yehuda does say that it is a longer part of the gid that you're obligated in, and the rabbi said it's just the part by the rounded area. And the 4th is, what if you eat a whole gid, but it's not a kazayit? The rabbis will say you're obligated, Rabbi Yehuda will say you're not. Okay, and with that, we're going to move on to the next Mishnah, which is a very basic Mishnah, because now we're going to do the next bunch of dapim, all about ta'arovot, mixtures, and what we do with kashrut. Okay, these are a very famous, beloved topic among the rabbis, trying to figure out when things get mixed up, and there's Isser and Heter, and how do you deal with it, and how do you know if it's nullified or not nullified. And we've seen this in many, many sugyot, both in food, even in, women, like he betrothed a woman, we're not sure which one, and now they're all mixed up, and all sorts of topics come up about ta'arovot. So we're going to get started. If you have a thigh that was cooked with the gid hanasheh, if it gives flavor, okay, and basically if you taste the gid in the meat, we're going to have to figure out how we evaluate that, because it's really all kind of the same taste, then it will be forbidden. Okay, that's how we generally deal with ta'arovot. Okay, we don't see shishim here yet, but usually shishim comes up. We're going to talk about that. But right now it just says, if it would give flavor, it's forbidden. How do you evaluate this? How do you assess it? If it really tastes the same. You figure out if the amount of the gid in there was a lefet, was a turnip, would you taste the flavor in the meat? Rashi tells us this, halacha l'mosh misina, that you use a lefet specifically to assess the taste, lefet in basar, okay, but that's the assessment. Gid hanasheh shenitbashel im hagidim. Now that was 2 different things. You have a gid in the yarech, in the thigh. What if you have a gid hanasheh with lots of other gid hanashehs? So there's going to be 2 options. Bizman shemikiro, if you can identify it and take it out, then you take it out and then you assess, benotein tam. Does it give taste? Does it not? Again, you have to figure out, if you cooked a lefet, would it have given flavor in that amount of, however much you had? V'im lav, but if not, kulam asurim. They're all forbidden, because if you take out any gid, it could be the one that is forbidden. Okay, so only if you remove it is it going to be permitted, and in the condition that it didn't give flavor. V'harotev benotein tam, but the sauce that's in there, right, that, since you're not eating the gid itself, when you eat the sauce, again, that's also benotein tam, if it gave flavor. V'chein chaticha shel nivela, v'chein chaticha shel dag, and the same thing would be true. A slice of meat that was a nevela mixed in with slices of kosher meat, or a slice of fish mixed in with there was chaticha shel dag tameh, a non-kosher fish that was mixed in shenitbashlu ima chatichot, that was mixed in with other similar slices. Same idea. Okay, this is what we call min b'mino, 2 of the same type. We're always going to be more strict here. Bizman shemikiram, if you recognize them, then benotein tam, if they give flavor. V'im lav kulan asirot, but if not, they're all forbidden. V'harotev benotein tam, and the same thing. The sauce, though, the gravy, will be only if it gave flavor. Okay, we're starting with Shmuel. Now, again, we have a lot to deal with this mission. We didn't cover all the topics that really come out of this, but that's what we have the next few days to do. Amar Shmuel, lo shanu ela shenit bashel. So the first thing Shmuel says is this is cooked. What does cooked mean in those days? Cooked means it was mixed. It was cooked in water in a pot, okay, or in a, I guess theoretically it could be in the oven with liquid. There's always liquid there. That's what they were talking about. Rotef. Okay, that's when it's all cooked, and that's why the flavor stays in. Aval nitzlaba, but if you roasted it or barbecued it, kolef ochel ach migil lagid. You could take that thigh and just slice it until you get to the gid, because in barbecuing, right, the taste comes off. It doesn't stay in. You're not cooking it all in the same thing with all the liquids, and it all stays in. To which the Gemara says, "Ini, is that really true?" But Ha'amar Rav Huna gidish etzla'o bechalbo. If you roasted a goat, a baby goat, a kid with its fats, which the fats are forbidden, asur le'echol afilu me'roshos. No, you can't eat even from the top of its ear. Okay, now, and that's kind of far away, and it wouldn't really get there. So what's the reason? No, the nature of fat that bubbles up and it kind of gets absorbed in everything else, right? It melts and kind of gets everywhere. But this, the gid, is not of the same substance, and that's not going to happen. So you start to realize it also depends on the substance, how you view these different things. So we've differentiated here between cooking and roasting, and that's where we're going to end today. We'll do a quick review. We started off with the whole sugi of tfiyut ayin and the difference between that and simanim. How there's the scale, which then we moved the scale a little bit. We thought tfiyut ayin was definitely always not as strong, or at least equal to, even though it's kind of in a different place on the scale. But we then saw that there's certain things where tfiyut ayin is better and stronger than simanim. Okay, particularly when it came to people and murder cases, or even, regular cases about people, like finding someone. Okay, then we got to the Gid and Hashem, these four machlokot between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, and what Shmuel said, where it's only this area where the Kaf HaYareches happens to be just the rabbi's opinion, and Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. And we had that whole back and forth then in the Mishnah between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. Then we got to the Yarech and the cooking of this, two different ways of cooking the Gid, either with other Gid and Hashez, or other Gidim that weren't forbidden, or with the meat, the meat of the thigh, and we saw the different halachot for each case. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.